Through connecting the readings to this question, my response concurred that settler colonialism has done nothing but negatively affect and, if anything, prevent Indigenous communities from having successful mobilization and organization, all through the account of the state's role in offering empty promises of liberalization to Indigenous communities. To begin, I think it's important to understand that the mobilization of Indigenous communities was created with the purpose to protect their lands which had been stolen. This is due to the fact, to quote Hume and Wolpe, that settler colonialism has existed just as long as the state has, because the settlers saw Turtle Island as empty land to begin with. With this, I want to focus on four main points that have not only affected but prevented Indigenous mobilization, which is state policies, police force, media outlets, and the desire for westward urbanization. When regarding state policies, I want to point out the 1969 White Paper, which was an active policy that contained no provisions to recognize and honor First Nations special rights, or to recognize and deal with grievances such as titles to land, Aboriginal treaty rights, or to facilitate meaningful Indigenous participation in the Canadian policymaking. This was a policy that forced Indigenous people to have to mobilize due to the fact it was an act that confirmed the history of settler colonialism, which was to assimilate Indigenous people in order to impose capitalism on their lands. Due to the fact, quote Hume and Wolpe, Indigenous people remain barriers for capitalist development. Even in the case of the 1997, part of my pronunciation, Dalgama Giz Dewa, in which Indigenous people claimed Aboriginal title and jurisdiction to over 58,000 square kilometers in northwest British Columbia. This was an act that appeared to display their mobilization, but instead was a prime example of westward urbanization of the state taking precedent over the mobilization of Indigenous peoples. This was seen when the Trans-Canada Coastal GasLink pipeline contended to run over 670 kilometers from Dawson Creek to Kitimat, BC. Not only did this ensue for the, pardon my pronunciation again, the Wet'suwet'en to organize and oppose the CGL pipeline, but was also a direct breach of the 1997 case, and again, setting back the Indigenous people's mobilization altogether due to the capitalist greed of the state itself. It was cases like this that contribute to my point that the state's police force was also contributing to the inability for Indigenous peoples to mobilize. This is due to the fact that in result of the pipelines, Indigenous peoples made a blockade in order to protect their lands. But instead, the RCMP decided to move in forcibly to dismantle this blockade and, in quote, arresting 14 land defenders, including one elder. With this wasn't also the first time that the RCMP had done things like this. Instances occurred, as Hume and Wolpe state. There was a situation in 2013 where at least 40 land defenders were arrested in Mi'kmaq, as well as in Ipperwash, Gustafin Lake, Burnt Church, Caledonia, Barrier Lake, and now Caledonia once again. This displays the state's distaste for Indigenous mobilization when it infringes on their desires for their own personal urbanization and profit. However, in modern day, I believe the biggest issue that colonialism and state involvement has posed on Indigenous mobilization is through media outlets. Throughout these readings, what stood out to me was the way in which news articles portrayed Indigenous communities in relation to the issue of these pipelines. I think it's extremely important to include that in these readings, it concluded that within 127 news articles published from Canadian news outlets, the themes concluded a characterization of land defenders as protesters, deeming the RCMP's work was out of public safety. Furthermore, they portrayed Indigenous groups as divided and characterized land defenders as obstructors. Not only were these published by mainstream outlets such as the Toronto Star and the Vancouver Sun, the main issue, though, with these publications is that the consumption of dominant media is directed towards white middle-class citizens and is consumed with a racialized description of those who fall outside of the boundaries of this normative construction. This not only shows the state's tolerance to ignore Indigenous peoples, except when they are practitioners of violence, while the state police are deemed as saviors. Overall, not only are the points I've stated evidence as to how settler colonialism has and is being continued to this day, but also as evidence as to how it directly displays the state's desire to limit and retract all mobilization that they have offered for Indigenous communities. These readings not only highlight the goal for settler colonialism, but also display it as an act to maintain continued access to Indigenous peoples' territories for the purpose of state formation and capitalist development. This reinforces that the goodness provided from the state to Indigenous communities can just as easily be retracted. Thank you.